Hello. Today we are taking a look at the most common visual design mistakes that people make when creating e-learning. So these mistakes can make your work look much less polished and less professional, and it can make it harder for your audience to interact and engage with your content. So let's take a look at these mistakes, and hopefully by the end of this video, you'll be able to up your visual design game. Okay, so I spend a lot of time reviewing other instructional designers and e-learning developers' projects, and these are just some of the mistakes that I've come across the most. And by fixing these little things, it can really improve how people perceive your project. So I put together a PowerPoint. I have a lot of examples included, so please stick around. And if you are looking for more visual design content, we have some other videos on this channel that will really help you improve your skill set. So let's dive into it. The 5 mistakes we're taking a look at are inconsistency. Again, this is probably the most important one. Non-standard buttons, lack of alignment, unintentional color choices, and insufficient spacing. So we'll start with inconsistency, and I have a lot of examples here. So the most common forms of inconsistency that I see are different font families within a single project, varying text sizes, very different stroke widths, colors, and varied illustration styles and visual directions. So again, to have a really professional end product, we really want to maintain consistency. We want to leverage that repetition design principle so that it looks like a very cohesive, consistent project. That's just going to make it better. Even if it's less fancy, simple and consistent is better than fancy and flowerful, let's say. Oh, and then layouts too. We want to make sure that the layouts we're using are consistent. This will make it easier for our audience to know where to look and how to consume the information in front of them. Okay, so first off, font families. You can see here we're using 3 different font families. We have one for the heading, one for the subheading, and one for the body text. Now, there are ways to carefully pair fonts. And if you Google best font pairings, you'll see some resources, right? We can use a different display font than our body text. But when you're getting started out, if you are a new designer, it is much safer to just stick with a single font family. That's going to do much more work for you. So here we are with Futura. This is the font that I use in this PowerPoint and on my website. I really like this font. And you can see we look much more consistent on this slide than we do here. And notice we can still vary the font weight. So, for our heading, that's like an extra bold. That subheading there is bold, and then the text itself is just book, I think. So it's a lighter weight. So we can still introduce some variation and some contrast by using a single font, and it's just going to keep things more consistent, because a bad font pairing, the risk is higher than the reward if you get a nice font pairing. So if you're new, just don't worry about mixing in multiple font families. Pick one and stick with it. That's a very safe way to go about this. So now we're going to talk about text size. And this is like a very common mistake that newer instructional designers and e-learning developers make. I made this mistake when I was getting started. It's very common. All I did here is I changed the subheading text size. So you can see now we have less contrast between the subheading and the heading. It's not the end of the world, but where this really becomes a problem, and again, so we have 3 text sizes on one page. Not the end of the world. We definitely don't want more than 3 on one page, but it becomes a problem when we go across multiple pages. So sometimes instructional designers, will stick with a body font size. Let's imagine this is size 24 body text. And then when we get to the next screen, we have a lot more content or a lot more text. So we're like, oh, let's just change the font size to make it fit like this. But this is like a number one way to make your designs look more amateur, is just to let's just change the font size to make this fit. That is not a good way to go about this. We want to stay consistent with our font sizes. So notice I'm going back. This is ideal. Right here, the subheading is the same font size as the body text. Here, we're introducing more variation. It looks a little bit less clean. And then across slides, again, that's the big no-no. We want to keep all of our font sizes consistent across slides. And the way I suggest doing this is having one main heading font size, and then a body font size. Those are the main two that you need: heading font size, body text size, and we don't change those ever throughout the whole project. No matter what slide we're on, those sizes are consistent. Now you may want to introduce a couple more. Maybe we do have a different size for the subheading, or for, maybe we have a main like title heading that goes on the title screen, and then we have a smaller font size for the titles on ensuing pages. And then maybe we have like a subtitle or caption font size that's like very, very small. But these are things that you want to design up front before getting too far along in your development. These are not things you want to change across your slides. So that consistency is key here. So here we go again. This is what we want. We have two font sizes here, a heading font size and a body text size. And for the subheading, we're just making it bold. That's what's going on this slide. Okay, stroke width. So stroke width is, if you're not familiar with stroke, it's what you see here. It's the outline of a shape, essentially. So people will have different elements that have strokes. Maybe it's buttons, maybe it is rectangles around text or around answer choices. And when we vary those, it's not going to look as good. Maybe there are times where we vary it intentionally, like when we hover over something, maybe then we have the stroke get bigger. But when we can keep it consistent like this, and we know, okay, there's a 1-point stroke around every single one of these outlined objects in my project, it's going to look more consistent. So this is maybe not as glaring or not as common of an inconsistency, but it is one that we do want to be aware of and fix up nevertheless. Now, colors. Inconsistent use of colors can really, really make a project look amateur. So we want to keep those colors consistent. This is the advice I give to everyone who is new to visual design. Just stick with black and white and then a single accent color, if you will, that really pops off of the screen for your buttons. Because again, generally in e-learning, we're looking for a continue button. We're looking for a select button to select an answer choice or submit a question. We want that button to really pop off the page. But I've seen people use all sorts of colors like browns and pinks and purples and 4 different shades of blues in one project, and there's no real need for that. So I know we want to find a good color scheme, like that's very common. We look up color schemes and we're like, oh, this looks really good. I'll use this color for my text, this color for something else, and this for something else. That complicates things, and if you don't know what you're doing with color, it can really hurt your project. So if there are brand colors that you're trying to align to, again, maybe there's a brand style guide that you can adhere to, or if it's just a portfolio project, maybe you look at some websites and see how they're using those colors if you want to mirror their brand. But overall, black, white, and a single accent color. Start with that and add additional colors as you need to, and only if there's a really good reason to do so. So we'll talk a little bit more about color later, but for example, we can have like a green success color or a red like incorrect or failure color, and a gray disabled state for like buttons, for example. But keep it simple with the colors, and if you are using colors, like don't have a different colored button on every single page, don't have a different colored heading on every page, like keep your text one color, your buttons one color. And again, we can have a whole video about like when to change colors and stuff, but try to keep it consistent and simple, especially if you're just starting out. So here we go. This is an example of that, just white and black with the single button color that really pops out. You can see it looks simple, but it's still clean. It's easy to consume. We're just adhering to these simple visual design principles and not trying to get too complex or confusing here. All right, so illustration style. So this is another one of those things that can really make a project look amateur, and this is very common when people are working on their portfolios. We're just trying to find graphics. You know, we know we want visuals in our project, but sometimes it's hard to find ones that look consistent, especially when you're trying to find graphics for free. So this combo right here, I see a lot in newer designers' e-learning projects. It's like, okay, well, they're both illustrations, so we're basically good to go, right? But if you look at the features of the people on the left, like their mouths and their eyes and their noses, like those little details, you'll notice it's different from the illustration on the right. So I probably could have picked an example where it's even more different, but even this, it's pretty subtle, but it's still like this is not consistent, and we would probably want to keep it more consistent like this. So these images came from storyset.com, and if you are having trouble finding graphics for your e-learning projects, I do have a whole video where we cover like 10 different really good sources for e-learning graphics. So check that video out. I'll link it in the description if you haven't seen it already. But really try to keep these illustration styles consistent. And likewise, generally we want to stick with either illustrated or photorealistic. And if you are doing photorealistic, we don't want it to be like black and white photos mixed in with color photos, mixed in with like really high saturation photos. Like the art style should be pretty cohesive and consistent. That's going to really, really make the project stand out in a professional way. If it's varied, it might say, okay, we were having trouble finding graphics, but hopefully you can put in that extra work and we can keep it consistent the whole way through. Especially with characters, that's where it really gets evident. When we have different characters that look slightly different, we want to avoid that. All right. And then finally, the last main piece here with consistency is with the layouts. So I noticed sometimes people switch it up. We'll have like an image on the left and text on the right, and then on the next slide, we'll kind of have text on the left and the image on the right. Generally, I suggest going with this layout for all of your content slides if you're going to go with like a text and image, just because the text is usually much more important than the images, which are usually more decorative, and our eyes are going to hit that text first. And then we just have the image there as like a nice supplementary graphic. Okay, so my suggestion, and this is what we help people with in the bootcamp, like when we're doing our visual mockups, we want to design one layout for each type of slide in your project. So for example, we want to design and iterate on one single question slide, because once we have that layout down, we're going to use that for every one of those types of questions in our whole project. Same thing for the content slide. Say we know every content slide will have text and an image. We would just design a slide like this and use that for every single slide where we have text and an image. The only time where we would break that is when there's a reason to. So we only introduce that variation when it's communicating something important. So same thing with everything we discussed, right? So if it's like, okay, something is different here, we want to communicate that this isn't a standard content slide. This is a slide where we're like speaking to our mentor or helper within this e-learning experience. Maybe that design will look much different. Maybe it's like a full screen background image with a character and like a speech bubble or something. So again, we only introduce variation when we want to communicate something with it. We don't want to just change things because like, oh, the changes will keep it interesting. That's a way to make it less consistent and take away from the professionalism of your project and just make it harder to consume, right? Every single time I hit a slide like this, I know how to consume the text. If we have all of our question slides consistent, once I hit the second or third one, I'm going to know exactly what's expected of me as soon as, in a split second upon seeing that layout. So that's the effect we're going for. That's why repetition and consistency is so powerful in design. Okay, so we're moving on. This is the second big visual design mistake. The first one, inconsistency, we kind of had like 5 different mistakes in one, but just, if nothing else, remember consistency is king in design. Now let's talk about these buttons. Okay, so with the buttons, I guess the main thing here is, we use buttons in e-learning that we wouldn't really find anywhere else on the web, and this makes our projects look kind of dated, kind of like just like stale e-learning. But we're designing web experiences, right? So we want to kind of mirror the design trends and the design principles that we can find on the websites that we know and love and visit every day. Because these are likely we want to imagine the websites that our audiences are going to every day and try to mirror those designs as well, not just the ones we like. But let me show you what I'm talking about here. So with the buttons, we want to use either very, very subtle rounding on those corners, or we go full rounding so that if you take both halves, it would kind of make a circle. And we want to use either fill or stroke. So the button is filled in with a solid color, or the button is not filled in and there's an outline around the edge of that button. But we don't want to go with both of those things. So these are the buttons that we see a lot in e-learning. So the first one, you can see we have these rounded corners, but it's not the most subtle. Maybe it's subtle compared to the one beneath it, but I'll show you kind of what we would see on the web. We're not going to really find a button like this anywhere on the web. And maybe that's a generalization. Like I'm sure we could find it somewhere, obviously, but on any popular websites or websites where they've invested a lot into like user experience design and user experience research, we're probably not going to see buttons shaped like that. The second one, and these are all kind of like Storyline's default shapes. So this is why we see these so much in e-learning, but it's also why, it's why this is such a common mistake, but it's still a mistake that we want to avoid. So the second button here, we have this kind of like half rounding. Like if we were to cut off both of those edges and put it together, it would make kind of like an oblong, like oval shape. Whereas ideally what we would find on the web is a nice circle if we took both of those corners and put them together. Or both of those sides, I should say. And then the third example here is how we would use a stroke and a fill. And we really don't want to go for that. Again, you're not really going to find that on any modern websites. So what will we find? So this is from a website called The Sill. So see how these buttons look nice? They have the fill color, so they're both fully filled in, and we do not have a stroke around the edges. And that might look like a pure rectangle, but this is what I meant by the very, very subtle rounded corners. So if you see those edges, there are a few pixels of rounding there. It is definitely not, it's not like the top one we see here. That's not very subtle at all, right? That just kind of makes this button look a little bit dated. But if we jump ahead here, this is what we'll find on modern websites that go with this rectangle type shape. And if you want to use the Storyline shapes and you don't really want to like design a custom button in Illustrator or Adobe XD or anything like that, then I would suggest just sticking with a regular rectangle instead of a shape like one of these. So just, no rounding, but we would still look kind of like these buttons we see here. So this is the other option. These are the fully rounded buttons, and this is from Articulate's website, and we can see it's full rounding. If we were to take both of those sides and kind of split them off right where the rounding started and merge them together, it will make a perfect circle. Whereas with this second one here, it's just going to make a kind of strange oval. We're not really going to find this shape in many places. Okay. And then again, we're looking at LinkedIn, and you can go to your favorite websites and see what kind of button design they're using. But you can see here the sign in button in the bottom left. Again, we have that full rounding. Same thing in the top right. You will see the top right, the sign in. That's an example of a button that has no fill, right? There's no color filling it up, but it does have a stroke around it. And people usually use those for like secondary call to actions. And here's a perfect example of that from Vyond's website. You can see they have this Learn More button. It has no fill, but a stroke around it. That's like the secondary action. And the main thing we want people to do is this try it free, start our free trial. And that has like the full fill, but no stroke. And you can also see it has that really subtle rounding in the corners. It's not a perfect sharp angle. And again, if you want to use a Storyline shape, I would highly suggest going with that perfect sharp angle because that's the closest thing to the actual buttons that people use on modern websites. It's what's going to keep your project looking the freshest, the most modern, the most up to date, and the most familiar to what people are already seeing on the web. If you do want to just add that extra little attention to detail, you can design a button like this in, again, Illustrator, Adobe XD, and I have tutorials about how to use those programs here on this channel. So hopefully, if you're going to take away the one actionable thing from this video, it's just avoid these shapes in your e-learning projects because it just immediately kind of dates the project a little bit. So go with the buttons that we see on modern websites. And let me know if you have any questions about this, especially this like secondary, primary call to action. These are a really good combo of designs to use. If you have two actions that you want people to take, maybe view resources and exit training, for example. If you really want people to view the resources and not exit yet, maybe we make the view resources this nice full fill, like on the right. And then the exit training would be like the no fill, but the stroke, the secondary option, like we see on the left. All right, lack of alignment. So we talk about alignment a good deal in my visual design principles video, which I'll mention again at the end of this, and I'll link in the description. But let's just quickly cover that here because I do see this mistake a lot. So again, if you're new, the best principle is just to stick with very strong left alignment. Okay, in some cases we'll use center alignment, but we don't really want to center our text if it's a lot of text because then we kind of get those choppy edges and we want to avoid that. So this is the common mistake that I see. People will have a heading that's kind of centered at the top of the slide, and then they'll have text over starting at the left. But you see how this does not look like a cohesive design, right? We have some center alignment going on, some left alignment going on. We want to want to clean this up a little bit, and that's why we use that really strong left alignment. You can imagine a straight line just going right through the left of that text. Like if we start it at the edge of that T and just draw a line straight down, everything is perfectly aligned to that, so we get that really, really sharp edge, and our eyes know exactly where to go every time we go to read a new line. So I would stick with this. If you are newer, just stick with the left alignment. It's hard to go wrong with that. And if you have images or things like that, within any given column, like right here, this is just a one column layout. But if we had a little image beneath this or a button beneath this, we would also keep that button aligned to the left. We wouldn't just like put the button in the center, for example. We want to keep it all nice and left aligned. Okay, so unintentional color choices. So again, color carries so much meaning in probably every culture. I mean, colors mean different things in different cultures, but like we need to be really intentional about how we're using colors and what information they convey. So in e-learning, at least for Western audiences, there are some general meanings for different colors. So red generally means we're looking at some kind of warning or some kind of incorrect response, like some kind of failure message, something along those lines. And we use green for success messages or correct answer choices or things like that. So when we're using green and red for like buttons or just like general text colors or just general shape colors, we need to be really careful, because if we're on an incorrect answer choice slide and we have a lot of green staring back at us, we're getting two conflicting messages, right? It's like the text might be telling us, oh yeah, you got this wrong, but the green might be kind of telling us that you did something right. So that's why we need to be really careful about how we're using those two colors. And I also see people use gray for their button designs a lot, but we want to use gray for these or I guess what I should say is generally gray buttons in e-learning signify that the buttons are currently disabled. So when you click on them, they won't do anything until you take some other action to unlock them and make them go back to their like default color. So we never want to like intentionally make a button gray, only if that button is currently disabled where we can't select it. Okay, so let's look at some examples. So yeah, we have, maybe this is a heading on a feedback screen. Maybe we have that nice green, that's right, or that red, not quite. So this way we're using color to reinforce our message and to just instantly, as soon as we land on that slide, if we perceive that color, we know whether or not we got it correct or not, for example. And same thing with an error slide, right? If it's like, oh, you cannot continue because you don't have sufficient permissions, red would make a lot of sense there. And then here are those buttons. So that gray button on the left, again, that's usually what you would see if that button isn't unlocked yet. Like maybe you need to select an answer choice before it turns blue and you can actually press it to continue. So that's what we're seeing here. So try to avoid gray. It usually signifies that something is not interactive currently, but it will be once you take a sufficient action. So again, sticking to black, white, and a nice accent color like this blue continue for the call to actions, that's the way to play it really safe when you're getting started with visual design. And finally, this one we talk about a lot when we're doing these visual design workshops, like in my bootcamp and stuff, insufficient spacing. This one might be a little bit trickier to develop your eye for, but once you do develop that eye, you're never going to be able to unsee this. So the main idea here is we want all of our elements on the page to have some breathing room. And I would suggest also kind of like how we want to look at what buttons and what button shapes and colors people are using on the websites you visit often. We also want to look at how people handle spacing on these modern websites where we know they put a lot of money into user testing and making sure that they're very user friendly. Okay, so there are two main terms that we should be familiar with when we're talking about spacing. So if we're looking at just this blue rectangle, okay? So if we have a shape, padding is the amount of space from the edges, the inside edges of that shape. Okay, so imagine if this white box in the center is just like a bunch of text and we have a rectangle around it. Padding is the amount of space away from either the left side, the top, the right, or the bottom before we have any other elements within that shape, right? So the other word is margin. So margin is the amount of spacing outside of a shape, but Yeah, just the amount of space outside of it. So no other elements, like these circles can't get any closer because we're adding margin outside of this rectangle. Now, if you're familiar with CSS, you actually define these terms in the CSS, like left margin, 20 pixels, right margin, 20 pixels, top padding, which would be the space, inside the top of the blue rectangle, before the top of the white rectangle starts. That would be top padding. So again, in CSS or a website builder like Webflow, that's what I built my website in, you would actually define these values with numeric values, with numbers and pixels. But in a tool like Articulate Storyline or Adobe Captivate, you need to kind of drag these out manually. There's nowhere you can just say, okay, give me 20 pixels of margin. You can, however, control the padding within a text box. But this isn't going to be a technical tutorial about how to do that. We just want to develop your eye for these type of things. So covering what we just covered, and pause this video if you need to, just to try to answer this question. What do you think we need to do to this button to make it look better? What do we need to add? Okay, and we want to use this language, margin or padding. So go ahead and pause the video if you need to now and try to answer that question. So we need to add a top and bottom padding here. Okay, so that will look like this. So you see we just add more padding and padding again, the space between the top of the button and the top of the text. That's what that top padding is. So in this case, it made our button bigger so that we can give the text inside more breathing room. And I guess another way you could have said this is we need to give the continue text more top and bottom margin. Because again, it's all about perspective. If we're looking at the rectangle, we need to add top and bottom padding because that will make it get taller. You know, it will push more space between the top of it and the top of the text. If we add margin to the text, we're adding spacing around the text itself. So both of those answers would be correct. Now, if you want to try again, go ahead and pause this one. What do we need to do here to fix this? Same exact thing. We need to add more top padding to the rectangle, or we need to add more top margin to the heading. Okay, because this heading, you notice, is really, really close to the rectangle above it. Maybe this rectangle is just the slide. So again, when you are designing a slide in Storyline, don't put your elements like right up to the edge of your slide. You want to imagine that you have some padding around the outline there. That's generally good practice. And again here, we need to add more margins between each of these text elements. So maybe more bottom margin beneath the heading and more bottom margin beneath the subheading. And this is where we arrive. You see everything has some room to breathe here. Yeah, it's not all cramped like this. Again, that's kind of the one sentence takeaway. Give your designs room to breathe when it comes to spacing. All right, so thank you for hanging out here with me this whole time. Again, I do have that visual design principles for e-learning video where we kind of dive into like the 5 essential principles. Maybe we dive into a couple more there. But definitely check that one out and just start looking for these things everywhere. Look for them in the other e-learning projects that you review, but also in the websites that you visit. There's also a longer, like hour-long webinar recording here on this channel where we apply these principles to an e-learning project that needs a lot of work. So you can also see how we actually apply it real time to a project. So check that out if you want to dive deeper here. But visual design is such a good skill to develop if you're working on e-learning, just because initial perceptions of your project really, really do affect how people engage with it. And when you do keep it nice and consistent and clean, it will be much more inviting and easy to consume, and people will spend a longer time on it and get less distracted. So very good skill set to develop. And then, of course, if this video did provide some value, please do like it and subscribe because it does help the channel a lot. And it just lets me know that putting the hours into videos like this is helping people. So I appreciate you, and I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.